And so that's why I feel led to talk to you very much today about the question of revival. I have spoken about it before, I always will do, because if you look at the Acts of the Apostles chapter 2, and you'll find what happened on the day of Pentecost, it's very clear that when it happened in chapter 2, verse 14, Peter stood up with the 11. Of course, Judas was no longer there. He didn't receive the Holy Spirit, did he? And then Peter spoke and said, "Be aware that these people are not drunk, seeing it's but the third hour of the day, but this is the fulfillment of Joel's prophecy," where in verse 17 he quotes it and says, "It will come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons, your daughters will prophesy, your young men see visions, and your old men dream dreams. And on my servants and on my handmaids I will pour out those days of my spirit, and I will show wonders in heaven." 21, "And it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved." Now, it's quite clear to me, firstly, that this was, as most of us would agree, the beginning of the church. The church as we know it didn't really begin until this outpouring of the Holy Spirit. The second thing about it is that it was accompanied by remarkable signs and wonders. And finally, I'm really thinking, and it's the first time I've seen it in this context, verse 21, where it says that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. So really, if you look at this, and if you've got a Bible, I suggest you do look, because it appears that this whole thing from verse 16 through to 21 is an emphasis on evangelism. But evangelism with signs and wonders with enormous power attached to it. Because where he's speaking of the remarkable signs that Joel had prophesied, remember this is from Joel chapter 2, being fulfilled in Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, it's absolutely clear that the prophecy from Joel was there would come a time with signs and wonders and miracles, not only with the people, but also in heaven and on earth. Wonders in heaven, signs on the earth. So that this was to be a remarkable period that had not been experienced in the same way before. But it culminates in verse 21, that whosoever shall call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. So what we're looking at is a period which commenced on the day of Pentecost, which was of miracles, signs, wonders, and salvation. And this is all happening in those days, those hours after Jesus had died, had risen, and had given the promise. And so the promise was being fulfilled. So right from the beginning, there was a necessity, in order to establish the church, there was a necessity of the miraculous. In this case, I'm sure you're quite aware as you read this, that the first two things which attracted the people, and after all 3,000 were saved, 3,000 men. Someone said if that's just the men with the women and children, it must have been about 10,000. So this is the first time where you've got large-scale evangelism. But the thing that attracted the people was they didn't actually see what happened to the 120 in the upper room. But when the 120 went out and began to make the noise, the people were astounded because the first miracle of tongues on Pentecost meant that all the nations, all the people who'd gathered in Jerusalem for the feast could hear the words of the gospel in their own language. Now that caused a stir, because in verse 6 of chapter 2 of the Acts it says, there were in Jerusalem devout men from every nation under heaven. It's because of the feast. And when this was noised abroad, the multitude came together and they were confounded because they heard them speak in their own languages. They were amazed and marveled, saying, Behold, are not all those which speak Galileans? How do we hear every man in our own language? So this was a powerful miracle. And this was the first thing that drew the people. You know, there is a tremendous power in the gospel. But the power in the gospel is not in the ordinary, not in the routine, not in the ceremony. The power of the gospel is in the extraordinary.